My name is Miles Hansen. I'm with World Trade Center Utah, and I'm very excited to have an opportunity to hear from Rachel, Jorge, and Theo today about the incredible work that IsraAID is doing around the world, and to help all of us take a step back and to think about some of these humanitarian crises, what's happening, and to learn more about an organization that's doing really impactful work to help people through all the various challenges that we have here in 2020. Before jumping into the program, very briefly, I'd just like to thank our partners on this event. First and foremost, Rachel Wallace, thank you for reaching out, for coming up with the idea of the event. We're excited to hear more from you in a minute. We're also very grateful to Baldomero Lago, who is the Chief International Officer at the UVU Office for Global Engagement. For those that don't know Baldomero, he is so much more than that. He's been very involved with UCCD and with the Utah Consular Corps, our other partners on the event. We're also grateful for David Utrilla, who is the president of the Utah Consular Corps right now, and also Felicia Maxwell Barrett, who is the executive director for UCCD, the Utah Center for Citizen Diplomacy. And so I'm excited about this because at World Trade Center Utah, we typically focus mostly on trade and investment. We've done a lot with Israel through the years. We've got Tom Jacobson, who's joining us today. Tom has been such an integral link between Utah and Israel for many years. And we work very closely with the Utah-Israel Business Council, most recently on a virtual trade mission to Israel just in July, where we had a few hundred Utah companies connecting with key leaders in Israel across several different key industries, very much focused on trade and investment. I just saw Ron say hello on the chat function. Ron, good morning. I hope you're doing well. Ron is another phenomenal partner and somebody that we've worked closely with on building out these trade investment relationships with Israel. But the Utah-Israel relationship is so much more than just trade and investment. For me personally, I actually met my wife in Jerusalem. And so Israel has a very special place in our heart, in our family, in our relationship. And Israel means so much to so many people here in Utah. And so Rachel, again, thank you so much for bringing all us together to learn about what Israel is doing to relieve humanitarian suffering around the world. And then as I want to have some conversations with thought about how Utah companies, individuals, entities can plug in and partner and be supportive, because the reason why the Utah-Israel relationship is so strong is because there's such great alignment of interests and objectives on many, many areas, and humanitarian relief and engaging and being a positive force in the world is an integral part of that. And so just to keep the conversation a little bit, and then Rachel will go ahead and introduce IsraAID. You think about 2020, right? We've got pandemics, we've got elections going on right now. We've had social unrest over very important racial issues. Here in Utah, we had earthquakes and windstorms. And we've all been focused on these things. But I think it's critical to remember that in 2019, there were many, many humanitarian crises that existed out there in the world. And even though we're all focused on a pandemic and these other issues in 2020, there's still that human suffering around the world, some related to the pandemic, but a lot of it unrelated by the pandemic. And yet the pandemic has made addressing these challenges more difficult, but also more important. And that's where I think the work that IsraAID is doing is so important. I'm excited to learn more about it, both the work that IsraAID is doing all the time, but then how is it adapting what it does in 2020 with all these unique challenges to continue to relieve suffering for individuals in many places around the world. And so I'm excited for the conversation. We do want to make this like a conversation. I imagine that if we weren't in a pandemic, all of us would be sitting in the conference room, not far from my office here at World Trade Center, Utah. We'd be around the table. We'd have an opportunity to ask questions, to engage in dialogue, to really make sure that this is calibrated in a way that's beneficial for all of us who are tuning in as we think about our respective organizations that we're involved in, how we can plug in and be supportive and do similar work as what IsraAID is doing. And so please don't be shy with the chat function, with Q&A. Ask your questions, drive the direction this conversation goes. And we're very excited to hear both from Rachel, but also Jorge and Theo. Before turning it over to Rachel, very quickly, just to provide a little bit of context, I'll go ahead and provide a little bit of background on Rachel, Jorge, and Theo. And then Rachel, I'll turn the time over to you. So Rachel is the Director of Outreach and Engagement at IsraAID. She oversees IsraAID's community and university partnerships, programs, and events, and she directs IsraAID's Humanitarian Fellowship. She has much experience with IsraAID's projects, long-term projects in Guatemala and Puerto Rico. Jorge Dennis is located here in Utah, but has got some good experience working with IsraAID. Jorge has worked with IsraAID's projects in Puerto Rico, including its water and psychosocial support projects, following Hurricane Maria on an exclusive mission for Latino leaders. He is president of the Salt Lake City-based EnviroClean and EnviroClean Real Estate. It's a commercial building maintenance and real estate companies with a workforce of over 200 people. He serves on several local and national boards, including the Utah Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, where he was the chair of the Government Relations Committee. And Theo Velez is a junior at Stanford, majoring in bioengineering and Mandarin. This past summer, Theo completed Marine Corps Platoon Leaders course at Officer Candidate School in Quantico, Virginia, and he plans to return there in a couple summers. Since April 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted supply chains around the country, Theo teamed up with a group of friends to create FarmLink, a hunger relief initiative, which now saves 1 million pounds of produce a week and connects farms with surplus food to communities who have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. You can tell we've got three incredible experts and leaders in their respective areas. We're excited to hear from them. And Rachel, with that introduction, I'll go ahead and hand the baton off over to you.
Thank you, Miles, for that really beautiful introduction about IsraAID and about humanitarian crises and about the Utah-Israel relationship. It's really an honor and a privilege for us to be here today with you, and a big thank you to you and Hannah and our other incredible Utah partners for working with us to implement today's program, especially because you all are so focused on connecting global international issues to our local US and Utah communities. So that's exactly what we do at IsraAID in the United States, and we're honored to be a part of that and to share a little bit more about some of the most severe humanitarian crises taking place today, and also provide a very unique perspective from the lens of IsraAID, which is Israel's leading humanitarian aid organization, and how we're responding to that. So I'll first start by sharing a bit about our organization. We, as mentioned, we're Israel's leading humanitarian aid organization, and often in our circles, we might hear that Israel is the first nation on the ground to respond to natural disasters, to respond to humanitarian crises in the world. And most of the time, that's IsraAID. And not only are most of the time we the first on the ground, but we're also the last to leave. So depending on the needs of the crisis, IsraAID will stay in the field for anywhere from 2 years, 5 years, sometimes even up to 10 years, depending on the needs of the local communities. And I should clarify that unlike, for example, USAID, which is a US government initiative, IsraAID is actually private. But we're very Israeli. That's in many cases what makes us unique, is that we can bring unique Israeli expertise and know-how to our response and to our field projects all over the world. And you'll hear a little bit more today in detail from Theo and Jorge about their experiences, which is really exciting to hear from people who have been with us directly in the field. But to kick off the conversation a little bit, I'll share that a unique piece of what we do in the field is in our mental health and psychosocial support response, our water expertise, our medical expertise, search and rescue expertise, and these are all very unique to a lot of the Israeli expertise that's developed in Israel, and we're able to bring it to the world. So I could really go on and on, but I want you all to hear today more about our actual projects in the field, about our actual work. So Theo and Jorge, I want to turn it over to you. First of all, where were you with IsraAID, and why, and how did you become connected to the organization? And we'll start with Jorge, then move to Theo.
Right. Well, appreciate being here with all of you. World Trade Center, thanks for having us on. Rachel, it's nice to be with you again. I was with Rachel in Puerto Rico about 1.5 years ago. How did I get involved with IsraAID? About 2 years ago, I was invited to join an Israeli trip, a trip to Israel with APAC. And I went there 2 years ago, almost to the day, and spent a week there. That led into other opportunities with other organizations, including IsraAID. So 3 months later, we get invited to join IsraAID for a project that they've been working on in Puerto Rico. I've been to Puerto Rico 4 times, and so Puerto Rico is pretty close to me. Love Puerto Rico, and so I jumped at the opportunity to be able to go down there and see exactly what Israel was doing, and frankly why they were there. Why is IsraAID in Puerto Rico? And so that's how I got involved, and I've stayed involved ever since then.
Great. Well, also I'd like to echo what Jorge was saying. Thank you so much to World Trade Center Utah for having us. It's an honor to be speaking here and to be representing IsraAID. I first had the opportunity of working with IsraAID my summer or a year before starting Stanford. So I took a gap year before starting school, and I had the chance actually to work with Team Rubicon, which is a American NGO that basically is a disaster relief and disaster response organization based on the premise of basically creating a community for veterans. And I worked with Israelis as a part of kind of like an IsraAID kind of addition or collaboration with Team Rubicon in Houston and Beaumont, Texas, after Hurricane Harvey had just hit kind of southeastern Texas. This was really intense kind of disaster response and disaster relief program. And it was really, really cool to see how kind of Israelis, who flew from the other side of the world were working with, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force veterans who are trying to apply their skill sets to disaster relief situations. It was just really interesting to see how Israelis and kind of these veterans got along so well because of kind of this common thread of being mission driven and service oriented, which is definitely, similar amongst kind of the veteran community and all Israelis, I would say. So that was a really, really great opportunity getting my foot in the door with IsraAID. And then last summer, I had the privilege and opportunity of working in Moria Refugee Camp, which is in Lesvos, Greece. This is kind of the refugee camp that most, if not all, Syrians had to kind of go through in order to get to mainland Europe. And today, it's mostly home to about 80% Afghan refugees and about 15-20% of kind of Congolese, Somalian, and still some Syrian refugees as well. So I was teaching English, French, and resume building workshops in a school which was kind of adjacent to Moria Refugee Camp. And I was there for a little under 2 months with the program.
That's great. Thank you, Jorge and Theo, for the brief introductions, and Rachel for your introduction. Theo, maybe we can start with you. I think you've got some photos, but I'd be curious to get more perspective on your experience in Lesvos at the Moria Refugee Camp. Could you talk a little bit about any personal stories? What was it like being there in the camp, both kind of connecting on an individual basis with refugees that were there, as well as you think about some of the bigger picture policy implications about how we help support refugees, or some of the lessons that you learned that were generated from these individual experiences that you were having there on the ground?
Certainly. Those are great questions, Miles. And I'd be happy to talk about them. If it suits you, I can also share my screen to kind of just illustrate my time in Moria.
Yep, absolutely. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's see.
Great. So this is the in the top left is the actual Moria Refugee Camp view from afar. In the top right, we see the actual camp itself, and in the bottom left is kind of the gate that lets us into the camp. So the camp actually was a military base for the Greek army originally. They turned this into a refugee camp, and they actually had such overcapacity and they were so under-resourced that they had to start putting refugees into the olive grove, which we see in the top right. And the olive grove is actually more dangerous than the refugee camp because they don't have as much supervision and they don't have kind of the structure and kind of security that they have within the camp itself. So this is kind of the context behind the camp. And in the bottom right, we see the school that I was working at. As you can see, it's very makeshift, tents and kind of kind of sheds are the classrooms that we used. To kind of answer your questions about personal stories, as you can see here in the top left, I'm teaching alongside a refugee named Aristote, who's Congolese, and he kind of worked with me to teach French and English to other Congolese, but also Afghan refugees. And kind of the thing that was most surprising to me before or once I arrived to Moria was that there's this kind of idea, I think, in the world where if you're a refugee, that means that you're helpless, it means that you're uneducated, it means that you really don't have much value to add. And that's what I came in thinking, and it couldn't have been further from the truth. You know, it turns out that so many of these people have advanced degrees, they have skills, they have know-how, they really have an understanding of the world, more so than a lot of people, you know, in the States that I've met. And what I've kind of realized is that the biggest inhibitor to kind of bringing these refugees who have skills into kind of into different workforces is the process of becoming a refugee itself. So what's interesting in Moria is that while these people are called refugees, they're actually asylum seekers. And refugee is a legal status that they're trying to obtain. And the process to becoming a refugee from asylum seeker actually can take up to 3 to 4 years in Moria. And that's the biggest problem that I saw from kind of like a policy lens, was that, you know, you get your first initial interview with the UN, and then they give you a date maybe a year and a half later for your follow-up interview. And all of this is being done by paper, and you're given an interview date on a piece of paper, and you have a little kind of, you know, identification card that the UNHCR gives you. And all of this could be made so much more efficient and productive if you were to introduce technology that already exists into the space. So I think one of the biggest kind of things I saw, as you can see, like in this school itself, is nothing is automated, nothing. And that's a huge inhibitor to kind of bringing in these people who have skills into kind of society and add to these places that would like to have them. As you can see here, this is kind of more pictures of, you know, the local soccer tournament to teaching French to, this was when we started in the top right, we started the French program with just maybe 5 students. By the time I left, we had maybe 45 students in each class. You know, and as always, IsraAID is distributing aid. You know, outside of the, you know, educational programs, you know, we're distributing sleeping bags. And since coronavirus has hit, we're distributing masks, hygiene kits, and all sorts of kind of relief items to the populace. These are some pictures that I took outside of Moria. So, you know, there's a bus that can take refugees to the actual town of Mytilene, which is about 50 minutes away. And as you can see, there's a huge amount of kind of tension between the refugees and kind of EU and, you know, policy in that lens. So these are just some pictures I thought would be interesting to share with everyone. And, you know, I don't know if anybody has heard about this recently, but about 6 weeks ago, actually the camp burnt down. So the camp that I was working at no longer exists. And the school I was teaching in also doesn't exist. This left 13,000 people without shelter. And no one really knows how the fire began. They think it was arson, but you know, essentially this made a situation that was already unlivable and unbearable worse. Today, these kind of 13,000 refugees live in a kind of makeshift new camp, which is actually close to the sea. And while, you know, on the surface, it seems like a much better environment, much better conditions, and right on the water, we're actually really worried about what's going to happen once winter hits. Because, you know, while this seems like, you know, it's a great, you know, it's less inland, so it's, you know, less dry and it's more kind of just on the water. Once winter hits, there's going to be, you know, water levels might rise, you know, tents might be getting wet, you know, rain, snow, cold weather is going to come, and that's going to be really tough for the refugees. So that's, you know, in the next month that needs to be addressed. Finally, I just want to leave everyone with this picture, which is what I took outside the walls of Moria. You know, the situation is actually crazy. It's crazy to think that this is happening in Europe. And this is kind of just, as I said, a no man's land, right? Where, you know, refugees and asylum seekers have left their homes, but they haven't actually made it to their final destination. So Moria is this kind of gray area where you're not technically a refugee, you're still an asylum seeker. You're seeking that status, and yet you can't work. So, you know, these are the problems that exist today. The teacher that I work with back in Moria, Aristote, he actually recently just made it to mainland Greece, which is amazing news. But like with many other refugees, he did not get there legally, which is the story of many, many other people in Moria. You know, it would have taken him 3 to 4 years to maybe even get the status to get over there. And he thought that didn't make sense. So he had to find ulterior means to getting there. And today now he's looking for work in mainland Greece. So with that, I can stop sharing my screen.
That's great. Thank you, Theo, for that overview, and thanks for the service you did there. One last question, then we'll go to Jorge to learn more about his experience in Puerto Rico. You know, we've focused on the Moria Refugee Camp. I know IsraAID is active in other parts of Greece as well as I believe in Germany. Can you talk a little bit about what IsraAID is doing elsewhere in Greece and in Germany, and perhaps how that ties into the work that you were doing there in the Moria Refugee Camp?
Yeah, definitely. So one other big program that IsraAID is engaged with in Greece is in the Thessaloniki. So this is a city in Greece. It's like a port city and on the Aegean Sea, and this is a place where they're working to kind of integrate refugees into Greek society. So this looks like educational programs, language programs, and then kind of like just skills and kind of, I think, resume building workshops as well in a way that lets refugees, once they get to mainland Greece, actually thrive. Because it's not enough just to get them into Greece. They need to basically integrate and be able to apply what they know to the workforce, because a lot of these refugees are skilled. So these kind of work programs and integration programs in the Thessaloniki's are crucial and critical. And then in Germany as well, there's similar programs going on, and I think there's a lot of psychosocial help happening as well. Naturally, with a journey that takes you from Afghanistan at the age of 2, then living in a refugee camp in Iran for maybe 10 to 15 years, then making it through Turkey, across the Mediterranean to Lesbos and then into mainland Greece. This is going to bring a huge amount of stress and PTSD to somebody. So a lot of these programs are also focusing on kind of the mental and emotional side of things, where this psychosocial help is cannot be underestimated, and those are the programs that are happening in Germany as well.
Great, thank you for that, Theo. I appreciate it. Let's leave Europe and in the Middle East, and let's talk about Puerto Rico. So Jorge, you visited IsraAID's long-term projects in Puerto Rico as part of its Hurricane Maria response. Most of us remember, Hurricane Maria hit in 2017, 3 years ago. Feels like 30 years ago because 2020 has been so long. But it was the deadliest hurricane to strike Puerto Rico. According to officials there, approximately 2,975 people died. About 100,000 homes were wiped out, and 95% of the island lost electricity, and 80% of the island's agriculture was destroyed. But Jorge, you visited the island a couple years later in the mountainous region, Barrio El Real, where IsraAID was operating with its partners. Jorge, can you tell us a little bit about Barrio El Real, where it's located, why was IsraAID there specifically, and why they chose that particular area everywhere where they could have been in Puerto Rico, where there's obviously some really serious acute needs far beyond Barrio El Real?
Sure. And as Theo did, I've got a few slides that I can share as we go along.
Yep.
Let me get my screen shared. As you mentioned, let's see. Everyone see that? Okay. As you mentioned, Hurricane Maria was a total devastating hurricane, largest to hit the island and one of the largest on record. It completely devastated Puerto Rico. And as you can see on this top left picture, to scale, you can see the size of the storm compared to the island. It completely engulfed the island. It was massive. The destruction it caused was severe. Over 230,000 homes were destroyed. Now, this happened in September. I happened to be there in January, 3 months later. And I'm almost embarrassed to say it was on a cruise stop. We had booked a cruise a year in advance, and we were the first ship to be able to get to Puerto Rico. San Juan had worked very hard. People had worked very hard. Organizations had worked very hard to get San Juan up and running because they needed tourism back. That's where most people live and work. And so when we were there, San Juan had power, but the majority of the islands still did not have power. Now, most of us here in Utah experienced some pretty severe windstorms a couple months ago, right? The winds hit over 100 miles an hour here where I live. I was without power for about 28 hours, which was terrifying. And to not be able to keep my drinks cold in my fridge was a great concern. Puerto Rico had areas that didn't have power for for up to a year, and so IsraAID was on the ground just days after Hurricane Maria hit. And what they started doing is helping with the acute needs, obviously, but then they'd go door to door and distribute temporary water filters for homes. Now, to my earlier question, my question was, what's Israel doing in Puerto Rico? And I'm going to back up a little bit. When I was in Israel 2 years ago, we had a unique perspective to be able to see a lot of things that most people don't see. We were taken to the borders of Lebanon and Syria. Here on the left is the border of Syria. Damascus is only 30 some miles away. On the right is Lebanon. And one thing that struck me with Israel and understanding their innovation is they're experts with water. And the reason that I'm showing you this picture is, if you notice, here's the border right here. Where the green ends is where the border of Syria and Israel lie. Where the green ends right here is the border where Israel and Lebanon lie. Somehow, in the same land, the Israelis have been able to turn a desert into an oasis. They are truly experts at this. And so when they got to Israel, to Puerto Rico, and started distributing these temporary filters, they found communities, including Barrio Real, a mountainous village in the middle of the island that had no power, no running water, and they were able to assist this community. So when we got there in January, almost a little over a year later, this water filter, as you see up here on the left, was just being finished being built. Israel had brought experts over in water filtration systems to be able to create a method by which this community could receive water without dependence on power. Their previous pump depended on having power to be able to run water to their community. This is a gravity-fed water filtration system. And I've got a video that I'll show here in a minute that'll show a little bit more detail on that. This is our group. We're hiking through the jungle, and we went up above where this source is to be able to see exactly where the source of the water was coming from. IsraAID had run some very basic PVC piping up to this waterfall that's above the pumps. And here you'll see right here, this is the source of where the water was coming into the pump. This is about a quarter mile up from where that pump is. There's nothing technologically advanced with this system. It's a very basic system, and it doesn't rely on power, so that when another hurricane hits, which it certainly will, they will be able to still continue to have water in this community. So by the time we got there, this pump had just finished being built. There was a festival in the community celebrating this pump. And so this is us in the community with some of our team and members of that community who were celebrating the completion of this pump and the ability that this community had now to have water. It was a great event. There was demonstrations for people to see how sediment filters work on a micro level. You'll see a sign that says here, the water, it says, water takes care of you, take care of the water. And so that was their goal, is to be able to take care of their water sources so that they can survive. So this is just one of the many things that IsraAID did in this particular community. It's worth noting that IsraAID was the only NGO in this community. Most of the NGOs had focused on the larger populous areas of the island, but had largely ignored some of the smaller communities. And if I could, there's a video I would like to share that will show what this
IsraAID began
community did. So okay, here we go.
by handing out water filters and educating locals on water pollution.
I don't think I can see it.
Or am I still on my?
Let's see. When it was the video, was we could hear the audio, but it was still showing your slide.
Okay, let me start that over.
Yep,
Can
there
you
we
see
go.
the video now? Okay.
Yeah, now we can see it.
I'll start this section over.
IsraAID began by handing out water filters and educating locals on water pollution. They stayed in one mountain village called El Real to build a gravity water filtration unit that could provide locals with clean water, whatever happens.
IsraAID brought filters to us. They really got involved into how can we operate the system itself. And they gave us quite a few challenges on how we could do it, how we could unite the people in the community so that we could all get together and take care of that.
I'm working here on a long-term water treatment project. So when it comes out of the system, it's 99.99% free of sediment and pathological bacteria. Without any power, without any pumps, or without any fuel, water is passing through the system and onto the local community.
We are prepared for the next hurricane because the people are more united. We know basically what to do. We could be able to survive.
I'm getting emotional because we had so much dirty water after the hurricane, we couldn't even wash clothes. The fact that we have the opportunity to have this filter is a blessing.
So I'll stop there on this particular project. And as you can see, it meant tremendous, it meant the world to the local community. We had the opportunity of speaking to many community members that day, and all were very grateful and emotional. They had no power for 8 months in this community. That means no water. And so to be able to have a system that would take care of their long-term needs was huge for them. So that was the water project. There was another project. I don't know if you want to get into that right now with the Aspida school.
Yeah, no, I think you go for it. I think the group would be interested in learning more about what you were doing at the school on the education front.
So as Theo mentioned, psychosocial support's a huge aspect of what IsraAID does. And again, the question, why Israel? Why IsraAID? Let me go back to sharing my screen. As I mentioned, I'd been in Israel for months prior to this. Now, if you all can picture Israel, I know Miles, you've been there. Some of you may have been there as well. Israel is, Utah is 10 times the size of Israel. Utah is much bigger than the whole nation of Israel. Israel is surrounded on the north by Hezbollah, by Syrian crisis, on the south in Gaza with Hamas. There's constant missile threat in Israel. When we were there in this community on the left, this is a kibbutz. This is a small Jewish community about a mile from Gaza. And there's tens and hundreds of bombs and rockets that come into this community almost daily. And this lady talked to us about how they prepare their children to deal with the trauma of constant missile threat. The buildings had mortar shell scars all over them. This was a game that she was showing us that helps kids understand and be able to process trauma and allow them to speak to how they feel about what's going on. Israelis grow up learning how to deal with trauma. It's part of their nature, something that we'll never understand. Our northern border is Idaho, right? I mean, and our southern border is Arizona. We could do far worse. These guys are surrounded by people that want to destroy them every single day. And so they bring that expertise and that mentality wherever they go and provide psychosocial support. So we got to visit this Aspida school in Puerto Rico. IsraAID had been there already for, I think, a year, helping the teachers of this school learn techniques and skills that would help their students be able to cope with the trauma that they were going through. They taught them, and this is a picture of us participating in one of the skills during that time. I don't remember all the skills, but I do remember one. We were passed out papers, and we were asked to write down our favorite superhero. We all wrote down our favorite superhero. Then we were asked to compare traits that superhero had to traits that we had. Well, I'm fast, or I'm strong, or I like to help people. And then we were able to see, okay, the characteristics that I share with a superhero make me a superhero. And these are the skills that they're teaching these young kids to help them recognize that they're strong enough, that they're able to cope with what's going on, and that they can survive. And so it's a huge benefit that IsraAID is providing. It's psychological first aid, really. And a lot of organizations, distribute water, they distribute help, and then they're gone. IsraAID has been able to stay long-term and help some of these communities develop methods that will help them cope. So that was the other quite fascinating and interesting project that we got to be able to witness firsthand there.
That's great. Thank you, Jorge, for that. Very quickly before we jump into the questions that we're getting from others, Theo, you had mentioned earlier that you done work with IsraAID in Texas. You were there after Hurricane Harvey, 2017. I think it's important to spend just a couple minutes talking about that, because we think of humanitarian disasters happening elsewhere in the world. I mean, this is a great example that we have, crises here in the United States. And in times like that, just like as the United States, we're out there helping others in the world. When we have our challenges, we have other people in the world who are here helping us work through things. And so, Theo, if you could talk maybe just a little bit about what you were doing in Texas, who you were working with, and what unique expertise IsraAID brought to the table as an Israeli organization.
Certainly. So first of all, we were in a little bit outside of Houston. So we were in Beaumont and in Port Arthur, Texas. So small towns, that were really, really hit by Hurricane Harvey. And as you said, like it was weird and it was difficult to be driving into these communities in Texas, in America, where it didn't really look like America, to be honest. Homes were completely destroyed and uplifted, and we went in to demolish homes, actually. So a lot of people think that you rebuild homes. Well, the first thing you actually have to do before you rebuild them is demolish them. So we were working with a group of really talented, hardworking Israelis. And what was actually really interesting is most of the Israelis I was with worked in kibbutz. So they were really young, sometimes not young, but really hardworking. And I think that was what was so impressive, is that the skill set that they brought was just pure perseverance and dedication. I remember just every veteran, there from Team Rubicon being absolutely amazed with the work ethic of the Israelis. And that's something I'm never going to forget. Every week there was kind of like the worker of the week, right? That really amazed everyone else, that really stood out. And I was there for, I think, 3 or 4 weeks. And I think, 2 out of 3 times or 3 out of 4 times, it was an Israeli on my team out of the 150 volunteers that were there. And that's not just because they were trying to, cater to this Israeli coalition. It was because they were actually the hardest working ones. So that was really, really cool to see. As I said, we were demolishing homes, making sure that a lot of the mold and asbestos that had kind of seeped through into the infrastructure of these homes and the scaffolding was no longer there. And then we were taking out basically every home's belongings and items that was ruined by the flooding. So we spent a lot of time working with local communities. A lot of times homeowners would come and help us. And then it was really cool to see the community rally behind this. We all lived in the church, in the local church, and we were, supplied meals, housing, and basically all necessities for free as we were working with the community. So that was just an awesome kind of entrance and kind of, first exposure to disaster relief and humanitarian aid, because as you said, it's not always on the other side of the world. Sometimes it's in our own backyard, and it's really cool to see a community rally behind these efforts. And we're seeing it now with the pandemic, with a lot of communities kind of growing and kind of facing this together. But it was really, really cool to see that back in 2018 as well.
That's great. Thank you, Theo, for sharing that. So Rachel, back to you. We learned about a few of the humanitarian crises today and the ways in which IsraAID is responding. How is IsraAID responding to the pandemic in other parts of the world?
Sure. First of all, I just want to add on one point that you mentioned about humanitarian crises happening in the States, in our own backyard, that sometimes it feels like a crisis is happening across the world, it's far away, but really this could have a local effect. And actually a story I want to share is that, as Theo mentioned, IsraAID has been working with Middle Eastern refugees in Greece and in Germany since 2015. We're still there today, recently responding to also the fires that consumed Moria Refugee Camp. But actually a very interesting story is that, believe it or not, the Yazidi community in Texas actually came out to volunteer with IsraAID. And that's because, believe it or not, they knew about us and our work and our support for the Yazidi refugee population in Greece. And what are the odds? There actually is a Yazidi refugee community in Texas, but they had heard from family, from friends, from community members, and wanted to pay it forward. So, you know, the lesson is, of course, that the world is much smaller than we think, and you never know what kind of impact you can make. That it could be a bigger impact even than one realizes, that can impact people beyond just where they're located in a specific country. And in terms of our response to COVID-19, we are responding in 16 nations in many different ways, actually. And I'm not going to be able to talk about all 16 today, but I wanted to highlight a few examples. One is actually IsraAID support for doctors and frontline healthcare workers. As Jorge mentioned, actually, mental health and psychosocial support, trauma support are some of our key areas of expertise. And I think that as an Israeli organization, after crises happen, we're not only empathetic, but we recognize the correlation between a crisis and how that can impact a community's psyche and mental health, given Israelis' own crises within their borders. They really get that. So we've been working with, in China, South Korea, and Italy, actually providing these doctors and healthcare workers who are on the front lines now with vital stress management and psychosocial support training, so that they feel like they have the support to continue their important work working with the masses. And this is an approach that we take often. We work with the people on the front lines who are supporting a wide range of people, and those communities are often overlooked. It's very common to just go straight to the masses, which of course is important and necessary. But what about the people that are risking their lives, that are on the front lines, to really support them? So IsraAID has worked with those communities in many capacities all over the world. For example, that was an approach also we took in Sierra Leone, supporting frontline healthcare workers who were responding to the Ebola crisis. Also, I want to go ahead and share my screen and share a little bit about one of our projects in Colombia. And we're actually responding to the Venezuelan refugee crisis there. And just like all of our or most of our actually COVID-19 response, we were in these countries pre-COVID. And we had to adjust our projects, of course, to meet the standards of COVID and also respond to COVID on top of what we were doing originally. So I'll take a step back here. And I talk about the Venezuelan refugee crisis because it's not one, at least from my experience, that has really made the news. Yet experts are saying that this crisis will actually even outnumber the Syrian refugee crisis. There are about 5 million Venezuelan refugees coming from Venezuela, and about 2 million have fled to Colombia. And we're working in an area called Barranquilla, which is here on the map, this red dot. So you can see it's not far from the Venezuelan border. But these are people that, while they haven't been in a war zone, the situation in Venezuela has basically, it's basically like it's an active war zone, even though it wasn't the situation of famine and corruption and lack of medical access and lack of ability to get basic medicines. That was, caused by a lot of corruption and internal causes and a lot of the violence that these Venezuelans are facing. And about 16% of the country has left. So that's a pretty high number. So IsraAID actually has been responding. We developed pre-COVID these child-friendly spaces together with the community. And those are spaces where literally kids can just be kids and process a lot of what they faced through a lot of creative therapy programs, like art therapy programs, also educational programs. And we built this center together with local community members in Barranquilla. Here's a picture. And we were also providing food to these families. And for many families, this was the only source of food actually that they were receiving that came from us. Since COVID-19 struck, of course, we can't gather in the space in the same way, of course, but as you can see on the left, we've used this space to be a hub, to be a center, to distribute hygiene supplies, and also a lot of do-it-yourself educational programs, a lot of psychosocial support kits, a lot of do-it-yourself type of art and creative therapy programs. And we've transitioned to do what we can online. And actually with several of our refugee communities, both in Greece and in Colombia also, we've piloted a program with an education tech app called Matika, which is Israeli. And it's also a math application that doesn't require any language. It's purely math. So one doesn't even need to know how to read even to do it. And it doesn't require that a teacher is present. And our hope is that one day these refugee children will be enrolled in school. So those are a few examples. And I'll also talk about another example in a country called Dominica. And I mention this because most people have never heard of Dominica. They think we mean Dominican Republic. But we've actually launched together with a UN agency and the local Ministry of Economics there in Dominica, a work online program to give young professionals actually the skills to be able to work online and to find jobs online. So those are a couple different examples.
Yep, that's great. Thank you for that, Rachel. One last question, and then we'll go to some of the Q&A that we've had come in. And my internet connection keeps coming and going. So if I drop out, I apologize, but Hannah is ready to carry on for us here. Rachel, we got people here involved. I'm looking down the list. I know these are all people who are very actively engaged personally as well as with their organizations. How do people get involved? How can people who are interested in engaging, either partnering as an organization or engaging as individuals, to participate with IsraAID in this important work?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, one reason why we're so grateful to World Trade Center Utah today is for the opportunity to be able to raise awareness for all of these crises in the world and the beneficiaries with which IsraAID works. So really, that's such a key and important step. If you or your organizations or your businesses are interested in speakers to talk about a lot of these crises, we'd be more than happy to work with you to arrange similar speakers, similar event to what you've experienced today. And actually, since COVID-19, one of our response efforts, we created a virtual stress management and self-care session, actually, because a lot of our US contacts came to us and said, hey, this is a really difficult, emotionally taxing, stressful time for us. Can you guys help? So we're happy to provide also that session to anyone who is interested in it. So far, a few thousand people have benefited from it and have said that it's actually been one of the most beneficial and impactful sessions that they've participated in. So those are two really very important ways to get involved. And for follow-up, my email is rwallace@israaid.org, and I will also add that to the chat, and we'd be more than happy to work with anyone on the session today following.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel, very much for that. Hannah, can you go ahead? I know that Neil submitted a question in the Q&A function. For some reason, when I got kicked out and got back in, I can't see the QA function right now on my screen. It's funny, you can do 10,000 Zoom calls, and for some reason, you still have these little oddities that pop up now and again. So Hannah, could you go ahead and read Nils's question, any others that have come in, and then also anything that's come into the chat, which also for me right now is not visible on the screen.
Of course, yes. So Nils is a USAID officer, and so he's kind of asking a question from that perspective. He's curious regarding IsraAID's approach to local partnering. Like, how do you identify partners? How do those partnerships generally look? What are some challenges you face in local partnering, capacity building, and stuff like that?
That's an excellent question. First of all, I'll start by saying that IsraAID doesn't initiate any projects in the field unless it has a local partner. We always take a community-based approach because for us, we're not an organization that comes in, let's say, for a few weeks, tells people what to do, and then exits. We're a very long-term organization, and our partners range depending on the situation, depending on the needs on the ground. They range from local schools, to universities, to government agencies. And also I'll mention about 80% of our staff are also local all over the world. So that's also instrumental in helping us identify partners. But you know, it honestly really depends from location to location. Generally, after a natural disaster, IsraAID has an assessment team. And sometimes, you know, it's not always easy to land right away. It takes some time to really assess the situation, assess where our expertise can be most beneficial. And also, IsraAID is very strategic. Most of the time, we try to identify where the gaps are. So for example, Jorge talked about Barrio Real. We were there because there weren't other humanitarian aid NGOs there. So it really just depends. It can take some time, but ultimately it's a two-way street when identifying partners, and if our expertise is a match for what they're looking for, whether that's in the mental health and psychosocial support, medical expertise, or water, that's generally how we find a partnership. And most of the time, we also are very focused on the long term. So a partner that will work with us in many cases for several years.
Great, thank you so much. Those are all the questions that we have. It's mostly just how people can get involved and learn more. Sorry, a quick question. How can someone volunteer with IsraAID either locally or internationally?
That's a great question. And also, I'll just mention, Ron posted in the chat, israaid.org/stress relief. A big thank you to Ron, who was very instrumental in helping us launch that. For anyone who wants to get a flavor of our mental health and psychosocial support, our stress management techniques firsthand, that's a site that's actually based on our stress management session. So feel free to check that out as well, israaid.org/stress relief. And in regards to volunteering, right now, to be honest, with COVID-19, of course, we can't send anyone abroad. For a while, actually, in California, we were actually partnering with local food banks, because that's where the volunteers were really needed. When COVID struck, as you can imagine, fewer volunteers were showing up at the food banks, yet hunger insecurity was only rising in the States. So now, actually, what you can do is you can sign up online. We have a volunteer roster, actually, which I'm happy to post in the chat as well. And that's a roster that we have almost 6,000 people. And how it works is if people have a certain skill set that's a match with what we need in the field, then IsraAID can review all of those names and make a match if it's a fit. So, and in terms of volunteering, I'll also add that our outreach component in the US is so crucial to what we do, because if not for our incredible ambassadors like Jorge and Theo, who share the stories of IsraAID, so much of these experiences, these crises, people would simply know nothing about. So that's also a really key way to get involved and make a difference, is through outreach and events with us.
That's really great. I'll turn it back to Miles and Rachel for any closing thoughts.
This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us today. For everybody who participated, if you want to connect with Rachel, Jorge, or Theo, we're very happy to arrange that for you. And I would strongly encourage you, to think about what are some of the best practices we've learned about today. How can we apply that in the global engagement that many of us are working on? And B, are there opportunities to engage specifically with IsraAID? If so, Rachel just posted her email address, and so you can reach out. So thank you to Rachel, thank you to Jorge and Theo, and thank you to all of you who joined us today.